All right, welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is Dominic Libertor, a Logistics and Finance Officer for CPI. We are here today for enabling robust stakeholder engagement at public utility commissions. Today it is September 24th. Thank you for joining us on a Friday, and happy Friday. I will be taking you through, just for those of you just joining us for the first time, we'll just be taking you through, what NARUC does and what our department does to sort of assist all the commissioners and our members. So we are a nonprofit founded in 1889. Our members are state regulatory commissioners in all 50 states and territories. FERC and FCC commissioners are also members. And we have associate members in over 20 other countries. NARUC members regulate electricity, natural gas, telecommunications, and water utilities. So essentially, our department, NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, we're a grant-funded team dedicated to providing technical assistance. We identify emerging challenges and connect state commissions with expertise and strategies to inform their decision-making. We build relationships, develop trainings, resources, and deliver trainings, some of them in person, as of late, mostly virtual. Hopefully that changes in the near future. We have a regular updated CPI fact sheet on our website, www.naruc.org/CPI. It'll take you to CPI-1. So we have a bunch of resources on our website, and I definitely want you all to check those out. So please take some time to do that. All right, and now I will introduce our moderator. Chair Megan Decker was appointed to Oregon Public Utility Commission by Governor Kate Brown in April 2017 and was promoted to Commissioner Chair in May 2018. Chair Decker represents Oregon as co-chair of the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, as well as a member of the Western Interconnection Regional Advisory Body and enrolled parties and States Committee of Northern Grid, a regional transmission planning organization. Chairwoman Decker, please take it over.
Thank you, Dominic. Can you hear me okay? I'll assume yes.
Yep, we
welcome
hear you.
To everyone. Okay, perfect. Welcome to everyone attending. I'm so pleased to be moderating this session. I first came into the energy regulatory arena as a clean energy advocate myself, and adapting PUC processes to engage and meaningfully include the perspectives of a diverse range of new stakeholders has been a priority for me during my tenure at the Oregon PUC. So I'm excited to learn from our speakers, who I'll introduce individually before they speak, but briefly are Jasmine McAdams with NARUC, Commissioner Obi Linton of the Maryland PSC, and Chandra Farley, an environmental and climate justice advocate and CEO of Resolve Consulting, among other things. We want to have a robust discussion after hearing from our panelists. So if you have questions as they speak, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A function. Without further ado, let's begin with Jasmine McAdams. She's a program officer with NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. There she works on transportation electrification, carbon capture utilization and storage, and nuclear energy. She started with a bachelor's degree in geology from Brown University, and before joining NARUC, Jasmine provided outreach, evaluation, and policy support to the US EPA's Office of Emergency Management and state and local energy and environment program. Take it away, Jasmine.
Awesome. Thank you, Chair Decker, for that introduction. And thank you so much to my co-panelists for being part of this conversation today. So I'm setting the stage this afternoon and laying out a decision-making framework for commissions to consider when designing stakeholder engagement processes. And NARUC published a report on this decision-making framework earlier this year, and the report summarizes emerging stakeholder engagement strategies used by PUCs, and it also offers a roadmap for commissions to evaluate key decision points, best practices, and relevant resources. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So we are currently experiencing an evolving regulatory landscape. Emerging issues such as energy infrastructure modernization, electricity system transition, resilience, new energy policy goals, and the intersection of utility regulation with other sectors, such as transportation, and hi, Sandra, have encouraged commissions to move towards emerging regulatory processes that better enable increased and improved stakeholder engagement. And robust stakeholder engagement processes are advantageous for several reasons, including that they can inform regulatory rulemakings with more complete and up-to-date considerations of stakeholder concerns. They can provide inclusive and accessible environments for discussion, and they can build stakeholder support throughout the regulatory process. Next slide, please. Okay. And so to develop the report, we gathered information from peer sharing calls, interviews, and literature reviews to examine engagement processes across 11 states. Those states and details about the relevant processes are listed on this map here. And you can see that we have a fairly wide geography or distribution of these processes that we examined. And next slide, please. And while I won't go into details about these proceedings during today's webinar, in the report, you can find a table listing all examined proceedings, a detailed summary of commission experiences, and a list of emerging best practices and key questions for commissions to consider that are aligned with the decision-making framework. Next slide. Using the feedback and information that we gathered, we developed the decision-making framework, which is outlined in this graphic on this slide. The framework is intended to guide commissions as they develop a process that accommodates their needs by identifying factors that influence the selection of a stakeholder engagement approach, providing emerging best practices for PUCs to consider, offering key questions, and pointing PUCs to additional resources. The framework is designed and organized into 6 categories: scope, facilitation approach, engagement approach, meeting format, timeline, and engagement outcomes and follow-up actions. For the remainder of my presentation, I will briefly walk through some of the key takeaways for each step of the framework. Next slide. Scoping is important for setting clear objectives and process parameters, and this step is fundamental for shaping the engagement that will ultimately that will ultimately occur. And so in this step, we want to define the focus of the stakeholder engagement process. And this focus can either be broad or specific. For example, a broad focus is Oregon Senate Bill 978 process, which broadly directed the PUC to establish a public process to investigate how developing industry trends, technologies, and policy drivers in the sector might impact the existing regulatory system and incentives. And then within this broad scope, the Commission later identified 4 major themes that came out of the stakeholder discussions. Identifying the purpose of the proceeding. This is generally either investigatory or decisional in intent. In Ohio, Power Forward's initiative is an example of an investigatory process. So it really explored system needs or reform options. And on the other hand, a decisional process is one which might result in a draft regulation. So something that occurred with Nevada Senate Bill 146 process. And it resulted in draft regulation for consideration. It's also in this stage important to assess internal capacity, and commissions can take inventory of internal resources such as staffing, venue options, data, and funding to identify available resources and needs and shift their approach accordingly. Lastly, commissions can consider who initiated the engagement process, as there are some things to keep in mind when depending on if the process is, for example, initiated by the Commission or if it's initiated by the utility. And we have a table in the report that kind of outlines some of these considerations. Next slide. The facilitator has a key role in the stakeholder engagement process. They can build and encourage discussion, educate stakeholders or Commission staff, and or help bring a group to consensus. We explored 3 common approaches to facilitation and summarize them based on advantages and challenges of each approach. So we looked at Commission-led approaches, utility-led, and third-party-led approaches. Some of the high-level takeaways that we found from our analysis was that the third-party process generally allows for more meaningful participation from the Commission itself. In Rhode Island and Oregon, third-party facilitation allowed the commission staff to participate at the stakeholder level. In addition, a third-party-led process can also contribute to transparency and a more limited perception of bias. A lesson that came out of the Arkansas PSC was to clearly define the role of the facilitator versus the commission staff. And what we found throughout the proceedings is that generally facilitator responsibilities included outlining the scope of the proceeding, establishing and enforcing ground rules, designing meeting agendas, leading, mediating, and negotiating discussions, and assigning homework. Next slide. Okay. Aspects of the engagement approach include stakeholder outreach, recruitment, communication of scope and education of stakeholders, and reaching consensus. So identifying stakeholders and conducting outreach. Part of developing an inclusive process is to assemble a group of stakeholders who are representative of the constituencies affected by commission decision-making. One tool that can be useful for identifying stakeholders is to develop a stakeholder map, which is shown here on the right and is adapted from DOE's Department of Energy's Energy Transition Initiative. And this can be useful as it allows stakeholders to be organized based on their impact on and interest in the outcome under consideration, as well as the type of engagement required. So this sort of mapping may be useful in thinking about different approaches to outreach and who should be at the table. Additionally, several commissions emphasize the importance of communicating the scope with stakeholders. During DC's grid modernization proceeding, the Public Service Commission developed charters for each work group, outlining the purpose and scope, as well as the composition, schedule, responsibilities, key questions, desired outcomes, and relevant deliverables. Commissions have used briefings, commissions have used a number of tools to educate stakeholders, and these include briefings and white papers, presentations, and bringing in outside experts. In addition, in Rhode Island, the commission even required all interested stakeholders to participate in to complete a petition to participate. And this petition included background information and an overview of the relevant subject matter. Lastly, another takeaway that we found is that reaching consensus in small increments was highly valued, especially when working with a large amount of stakeholders. Doing this in increments rather than at the end really avoided any miscommunication or any other sort of challenges. Next slide. The meeting format deals a little bit more with some of the logistics of the engagement approach, but is consequential for the overall inclusion and accessibility. Commissions may consider venues for participation that are best aligned with the purpose of the engagement. And I encourage folks to take a look at the spectrum of process for collaboration and consensus building in public decisions, as this provides a matrix for deciding what type of meeting format is most appropriate. So whether that be roundtable discussions or task forces, it really outlines some of the considerations to make when choosing the best venue. In addition, measures can also be taken to make participation more accessible. So this can be providing language translation services, ensuring accessibility to meeting spaces. Is there a ramp available, for example? Providing virtual options for participation. And now this is obviously a lot more feasible, but even post-COVID, what does this look like? And consider rotating meeting times so that stakeholders with different work schedules are able to participate, whether that be within the 9-to-5 schedule or outside of that. And in Puerto Rico, for example, the distribution system planning process, within that process, the meetings were kept pretty short and also held virtually in order to allow for broader participation. Next slide. Great. We found that it is important for commissions to set timelines to not only to plan, but also to anticipate for when disagreements might arise and prepare for difficult discussions. And in establishing a timeline, we identified several key lessons. The first is to set timelines by working backwards from the due date. And the second is to design timelines to accommodate flexibility. For example, in Ohio's Power Forward initiative, each phase of the initiative was planned with about with a few months of buffer in between. And this was done in order to allow for any unforeseen changes or to allow for more information gathering. And then lastly, stakeholders, it is also important to communicate these timelines with stakeholders, and you'll see that this is a very reoccurring theme, is to be very intentional and clear in communication with stakeholders. But in the Oregon process, this was also indicated as a very important feature, and the stakeholders themselves actually provided feedback that it is important to communicate clear timelines and expectations throughout the process. Next slide. Okay. And finally, we have engagement outcomes and follow-up. And like I said earlier, again, this is a huge point, but I want to emphasize the importance of being clear in communication with stakeholders about how they will really contribute to the outcomes of the public process. Commissions can also consider setting aside resources for follow-up and to solicit input from stakeholders. The Power Forward initiative did facilitate some follow-up discussions with a third party with stakeholders, and then in DC, through the grid modernization proceeding, they did release a stakeholder survey to all stakeholders, just gathering feedback on how the process went overall. Next slide. Great. So I'm really hoping that this framework can be a useful tool for commissions as they consider these emerging processes. Thank you all for your time. If you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. I will now turn it back to Chair Decker to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jasmine. And thanks to NARUC for recognizing and amplifying this important work from around the country. It's a really clear and I think helpful framework. Next, we'll hear from Commissioner Obi Linton, who was appointed to the Maryland Public Service Commission in 2017 after more than 2 decades in various utility regulatory adjacent roles, ranging all the way from meter reader and engineering intern at a New Jersey utility to a regulatory attorney for Baltimore Gas and Electric, a lawyer in private practice, and he's held various roles at the Maryland Commission, including law intern, deputy staff counsel, leader of the Consumer Dispute Resolution Unit, and director of the Consumer Affairs Office. Commissioner Linton is currently the chair of NARUC's Consumers and the Public Interest Committee and serves on several other important NARUC committees and played a founding role with what has now evolved into NARUC's Regulatory and Industry Diversity Committees. Welcome, Commissioner Linton. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair Decker, and thank you to NARUC and to CPI for inviting me to participate in this important launch for this report. The importance of having a robust stakeholder process for a commission really can't be overstated. The commissions structurally and historically are primarily designed to operate in a quasi-judicial way. So it's important to make sure that parties are able to retain their appellate rights. Most commissions don't have to follow certain federal rules of civil procedure, but at the same time, it's important for them to make certain that the general public is able to contribute and participate in a process that is somewhat foreign to them. And at the same time, is a process that includes parties that are extremely sophisticated and very adept at understanding what the issues are and have access to far more information and experience. So it's always a challenge for a commission and now for me as a commissioner to figure out the best way to create a process to do that. So a report like this is important because it gives a number of parties, and specifically commissions, but even parties that are not commissions, and the opportunity to understand that there are procedures that will allow them to participate in what are very complex and very important processes that regulatory bodies engage in. So one of the things that may not have been mentioned for discussing my background is that I've actually sat on a wide range of work groups over the years, both on the utility side and working as a commission staff. I haven't sat on any lately as a commissioner, but most recently I was one of the chairpersons for the Commission's PC 44 process for one of those particular work groups, as we call them in Maryland. And so I was pretty pleased to hear that that was one of the processes that was going to be included in this report, because the structure of the work group, as the report lays out, is critical. Work group leaders have to have very detailed structure as to how they're going to proceed. The expectations have to be clear, not just to the work group leader, but to all of the parties that are participating in the work group. And so it's important to make sure that everybody understands what the end goal is going to be, what the outcome is expected to be. Are you looking to establish regulations? You're looking to draft a utility-led tariff, a pilot program, further study after the work group finishes and reports back to the commission. Understanding what's expected of the group helps to focus all of the parties, and it helps the leader move forward with whatever decision-making process it has to go through. So these are effectively multi-party negotiations. And so there's a lot of technique in working through something of that sort. It takes some time to learn it from a leadership perspective, and it takes time to participate as a party. Utility companies, of course, have been engaged in them for as many years as the commissions have had them, because they tend to always be the ones participating, as well as utility advocates. But trying to make sure that the average consumer or a small nonprofit organization can also participate is important, because they also have not just a stake in the process, but they also have a lot of commitment from the general public. And so the structure of the work group in terms of the expectations is critical. The structure of making certain that all the parties are aware of what their responsibilities are, that's important. And so there are a number of ways that you can go about making sure that that happens. One of the things that I used to do when I was chair of a work group, my first meeting was always an event meeting. So I didn't really plan on getting anything done that day, because you tended to have the most senior executives showing up. The parties would be there represented by a wide range of folks who you may not see too often anymore. But their goal was really to just kind of set the tone from their company's perspective or their organization's perspective. And after they finished, you would hope to see them again. They were probably monitoring in the background, but they didn't like coming every single meeting. So I gave them the opportunity to say their piece. And I let them know that one of the meatier topics would be the first one that we talk about. And so that immediately required that they had to show up again. And so having decision makers in the room was an important component. The last thing you wanted to have was people participating who really couldn't hear things that are coming from other stakeholders and also couldn't make a decision at that moment. That people have to always go back and ask someone else and get verification and then get clarification and return a month later or a week later for another meeting. You really miss out on the opportunity to develop some inertia towards finding solutions either on a small scale or on a large scale. So making certain that the parties that are in the room need to be in the room and can make decisions is a critical component. So you can't have stakeholder process, can't have a robust stakeholder process if the stakeholders aren't robust. So there really isn't any other way to get there other than to make sure that when they show up, they have something to say and they can commit and move forward. So there's oftentimes disagreements. It is at times a very complicated process. Parties will change positions. Parties will raise ideas. They'll find ways to deflect and cause the discussions to extend to a longer period because they don't want to see a resolution at all. So it's important to have an idea, either as a work group leader or as a member or person attending, to have some idea about what everybody wants to see accomplished in that meeting, in those meetings rather. So doing something like that helps to make sure that everybody's on the same page. But also, if you're able to talk a little bit about what somebody else might want, there's a bit of empathy that comes into the discussions at that point. So now if parties understand that you understand what their concerns are, you're a little bit further towards having a solution. You're a little further along the lines to getting to a point where everybody's able to agree. And ultimately that agreement might be begrudging. They may not be thoroughly pleased with it. But typically, if you have a work group process and one party is very happy and all the rest aren't, you probably did something wrong along the way. So engaging in multi-party discussions has a wide range of little issues like that that are important to maintain and manage along the way. For commissioners, it is important to set up a structure in advance, understanding what the issue is, basically what you as a commissioner would want, and empowering your leadership of that work group so that they can go forward and resolve the matters as they need to. It's important to make sure that the parties understand that they are all equals in the discussions. Even though one party may have a regulatory responsibility, they may have rate cases and they're a utility, or they're a party that advocates for consumers, or they're an individual who shows up at the meetings and would like to make certain comments. Everybody has to have the same level of respect. Everybody has to be respected for their opinions. And at the same time, though, you have to, as we like to say sometimes in Maryland, keep the trains moving. So that means that even though you want to hear everybody out, there's a goal long term and decisions have to get made. So what you don't want is to have parties slowing down the process and causing different types of disarray along the way. And that can happen, and sometimes it's intentional. So those are general little tips. I guess the main point is that at the end, processes like this, commissions have used them a lot to handle challenges that are significant and at the same time, challenges that would require a lot of input from parties that don't normally participate in front of the commission. So it's a fairly unique process. We've been using it in Maryland now for about 25 years or so. We initially started with, believe it or not, the deregulation of our electric markets. That was one of the first times we used work groups in a very large manner. So we had work groups looking at competitive metering back before smart meters existed, consolidated billing for deregulated marketers on the electricity side. And this is before parties were even considering situations where suppliers would be able to send you a bill instead of your regulated utility company. We were looking at a wide range of different issues, including stranded costs, which is a term you probably don't hear much anymore, related to electricity in general, even though it's still there. But those types of issues were discussed in work groups. And the primary reason is that to follow the commission's quasi-judicial administrative processes to try and ferret out all of the many issues that were in those challenges of unwinding an industry and creating a whole new market, it would have taken years to do it. And it made sense to have the 25 or 30 different unique parties that wanted to participate, to just send them all in a room and let them figure it out, and then come back and tell us the best way to handle it. And so it was about economy, making certain that we had an answer in a short period of time, but at the same time, giving all the parties voice and an opportunity to participate in the discussions. Those were fairly extensive meetings. They lasted for a couple of years, but the end result, some issues never really resolved. Like in Maryland, we still do not have a competitive metering market. That was one of the work groups that never went anywhere. Our universal service work group, which was one that dealt with low-income programs, energy assistance related matters, those meetings have bifurcated or maybe even trifurcated off to several different work groups and are still ongoing. So here we are 25 years later, and those meetings and those issues are still getting debated, but they get debated on a wide range of new challenges that come up. I mean, they're talking about consumer impacts related to COVID now. So those issues are all ongoing issues. So work groups, even though they should have end time frames for certain responsibilities, the amount of expertise in the room is almost too good to let go. And so we encourage them to continue meeting because there's always new issues that have to be discussed. And it becomes a very valuable tool for commissioners to find ways to resolve challenges that are, quite frankly, too big for an administrative or quasi-judicial process. You don't want to have an evidentiary hearing to talk about how do we initiate a competitive metering market. That would take months to resolve. And the amount of issues that you'd have to look into, it wouldn't be efficient at all. So it makes more sense to have the parties resolve it independently. And in the case of Maryland, it didn't work out so well, but the general idea was to try and allow parties to figure it out on their own. So a report like this, like the one that we're discussing here today, is something that I hope will help a lot of commissions deal with a wide range of new and environmental challenges that are coming out now and have been discussed for many years. But new challenges, and as our Grid of the Future process demonstrated, challenges that for our commission were unique and fairly original for Maryland to face. We've established, as you already know from reading the report, our PC 44 process opened the doors to a range of new solutions, including our transportation of the electrification of the transportation sector and interconnections, which are two of the ones that I think were most successful. But in particular, those two created new mechanisms and helped move the industry forward in Maryland in ways that a evidentiary proceeding or even a action by our General Assembly may not have worked out as efficiently. So I commend NARUC and CPI for this report. I think it's an important concept. It has a lot of very good information in it. If you haven't taken a chance to read it, I encourage you to do so. And hopefully it will help not only commissions, but a number of parties that are engaging with the commission, either on a regular basis or maybe just on occasion, to help you understand about the types of options that are available and that probably aren't written in a statute somewhere, but are just options that commissions can use to resolve complex matters among multiple parties. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I would now return the control over to Chair Decker.
Thank you, Commissioner Linton. I love how your experience going from multi-party work group leader to commissioner generates these concrete tips about beginning with the end in mind and encouraging decision makers into the room and keeping the train moving when not everyone is happy. So last but not least, we're lucky to have Chandra Farley, CEO of Resolve Consulting and the Environment and Climate Justice Chair of the Georgia NAACP. Resolve is a consulting practice with a mission to increase the impact of climate justice initiatives by creating equity-centered delivery infrastructure. Chandra has a really incredible career history that demonstrates her passion for elevating the connection between environmental stewardship, strong communities, and our daily lives. Among other things, her experience includes time at South Face Energy Institute and Partnership for Southern Equity. She formed the Good Energy Project with a vision to connect the transformational power of Black women to the movement for just and equitable clean energy. Without listing all the places she presently serves, I'll just say the list reflects a deep commitment to the intersection of community and environment, and really looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chair Decker, and to Jasmine and to NARUC for inviting me to speak with you all today. It's a critical issue, and I am excited about the issue of, the potential for equity related to utility regulation and sort of commission operations as we talk about, what are examples of bringing equity into commission processes. So to really start, and you get this from my background, I have a technical background in buildings and have worked on the nonprofit efficiency program side, working for a building science nonprofit who delivered energy, water, resource efficiency programs for nonprofits, which was really my first, I feel like, my first introduction to energy equity that really applies to the residential customer focus, that residential and really small business community customer focus that I have today. And that has really been informed by the not understanding, or the people who stand to benefit the most from utility programs or rebates, not understanding how to access them, let alone understanding the long road and process that comes along with that, a lot of times particularly related to the regulatory process. And Commissioner Linton mentioned or characterized this as a foreign process, and that is a term I certainly use. I am based in Atlanta, Georgia, and so my on-the-ground work and my work in partnership with communities and coalitions on the ground is focused here. Across the region, it's been Southeast focused, and then being able to participate and work in a national context to learn from other places, particularly when focusing on the South. We are just now getting to the point where the equity conversation, the energy justice conversation, and an energy democracy conversation is just beginning to bubble up and filter over into, I feel like, a lot of our utility and commission engagement. And, just as I was saying in the beginning, while unfamiliar, to many residents, and equity-centered energy, utility, and climate policies, we know, can positively impact household economic stability. It can improve the overall quality of our air, our land, our water, all of our natural resources that affect our health and well-being. However, Black communities, communities of color, our rural and low wealth communities remain virtually unrepresented in the energy planning and decision-making processes that can drive equitable or often inequitable outcomes in energy production, distribution, and regulation. So in talking about what does, equity in utility regulation, equity in the process look like, this is a conversation about the people. And how we can always make sure and always be thinking about and remembering that there is a person on the other side of that light switch, right? There's a person flipping a light switch. There is a person starting up the building automation system. And, if we're talking about larger industrial facilities, or even some small businesses coming on to, there's someone flipping on a light switch, or starting up the stove. And that is what equity is about. Equity is about people. And we can talk about equal rights under the law or equality, which have afforded many opportunities to those previously denied certain unalienable rights, right? However, when we talk about an equity agenda, we are talking about the opportunity to account for differences in opportunities and burdens to propose and pursue just and equitable solutions, ultimately helping us achieve systems level change, which is really what we are talking about. We're talking about leveraging equity and utilizing equity as a tool, not just a word, but an actual tool, a strategic approach, a strategic framework to achieve these transformative shifts and systems level change that we need to make sure that our decision making around energy, around utilities, is grounded in community and people. And so today, you know, there are a ton of ground organizations and initiatives, specifically racial equity. And I came from Partnership for Southern Equity, where I spent about 4 years as the Just Energy director. And all of these conversations about how we approach equity, and I think the strategic framework that Jasmine went over, these things are very important because this is where it begins. Coming together, getting broad input. I think, you know, it is time to really redefine the idea of what we consider an energy stakeholder, and understanding that we need a bigger tent as we're making those decisions. And one of the important things for level setting with these strategic frameworks and ideas is, what is equity? What are we talking about, right? There's lots of, equity is a very beautiful word, but one of the first quotes I wrote down even back before I started working at PSE from the founder and chief equity officer of that organization is that equity is a way of doing things. It's not just a what. So that was very formative for me in my own personal equity journey and in doing this work, and understanding that we've all got a level set around just what are we talking about. Because even though we can talk about household economic stability, we can talk about energy burden, we can talk about the disproportionate impacts of carbon-based fossil fuel, you know, carbon emissions, fossil fuel-based energy production. But how are the people sitting around their kitchen table in the evenings talking about these multiple pain points that they're dealing with every day, largely driven by, in a lot of cases, from health and wellness to household economic stability, as we talked about, really driven by the decisions that are being made when we talk about energy planning and decision making. So we at PSE and our partners through the Just Energy Circle, which is a coalition where we bring together the, you know, uncommon allies. I will always be a member of the Just Energy Circle ecosystem because that is what it is all about. And Commissioner Linton spoke to this, you know, idea of making sure we've got people that can be engaged in the full spectrum of decision making. And so increasing equity is about increasing the opportunities for public participation. So most state utility regulatory commissions, you know, at least in the South, are hearing about energy equity, hearing about energy justice, but haven't begun to really address equity as a part of their decision making. And to the extent that equity issues are heard or addressed, that has normally come through public comment or formal comment received or income qualified energy efficiency programs. So this is one of the key ways that we, you know, should be advancing a more equitable energy planning and decision-making process. But we also understand that providing comments and participating in these processes can be a very large undertaking, particularly for under-resourced organizations and individuals that just don't have the time or capacity to do so. But we've seen some good examples, for instance, in some states such as South Carolina and Florida, where regulators hold public comment sessions in various parts of the state. You know, sometimes our commissions, just like our state houses, are in one part of the state, but we've got a whole state to cover with these decisions. So that public meeting and public comment opportunity are critical because it's the local voices that are heard that can drive changes in decisions, such as when regulators significantly reduced Dominion Energy's request to raise rates in South Carolina a couple of years ago. So we're going to get to questions which I'm excited about, but considering the scale and the systemic nature of the issue of inequities related to energy delivery, production, consumption, and regulation, it's critical that we understand equity can't be addressed without instituting key metrics for every decision of when we're talking about regulation. And so we can talk about many examples. There's some examples, even at the federal level, looking at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And after 30-ish years, I've finally established their Office of Public Participation, where they did a series of workshops, a series of listening sessions with a number of environmental justice and equity groups. I was able to take part in that, and are now doing another round of engagement as they continue to make decisions. Looking at intervener compensation programs. So when we talk about the burdens on most impacted group and most marginalized groups and what they really need to be able to authentically and fully show up and engage in these processes, which are long, right? Here in Georgia, the integrated resource plan process happens every 3 years, but that first 6 months of the, 5-6 months working on that part, then it's immediately followed by a rate case, which can be, 4 months with their own public comment opportunities, opportunities to submit, comment electronically, and the outside game that goes along with that as well. So making sure that our most impacted groups, because we know our most impacted groups, our most marginalized groups are the groups that really stand to benefit the most from transitioning to a clean energy economy, greater investment in energy efficiency programs that impact things like economic development opportunities. So really, when we're talking about that full spectrum of decision making, we're also talking about the need to address that full spectrum of the issues that energy and utility decision making can trigger positively and sometimes negatively for communities that we are talking about. So organizing and mobilizing, training and advocacy supported by things like intervener compensation programs. I'm really looking forward to, learning more about what Maryland has done, and as Commissioner Linton spoke about, to start embedding and institutionalizing these practices, not just on the outside in the community groups with the stakeholders, but within the commissions themselves. So I will take a stop there, and I look forward to engaging in our conversation.
Great, thank you for those very rich comments, and it's great to have someone with your depth of experience around this industry in the conversation here. We've gotten a number of excellent questions through the Q&A function, so I'm going to start there and maybe try to pull a few of them together for you each to respond to. One of the questions we received is, how are commissions working to enable and ensure direct participation of community-based organizations, especially within communities of color and under-resourced communities, in these stakeholder processes, as well as in commission decisions and processes directly? That's one part of the question, is sort of how are commissions kind of pulling that in? Another part of the same question is, how can the commissions be better ensuring that impacted communities are directly involved rather than through a representative organization? I am very curious about that one from the community organizer perspective, because I think our commission really struggles with that sort of direct involvement piece. As you respond to this, I think there were some other questions around, as you bring folks in, how do you deal with information availability and transparency? And I'm curious too, how, as we're engaging folks, while we come out of the the COVID pandemic, how do we balance that sort of in-person versus virtual mode to engage communities? So I think maybe we'll start with Commissioner Linton, go back to Jasmine, and then let Chandra have the last word.
Thank you, Chair Decker, and thank you to the one or several folks that answered those questions. There's a bit to unpack there. So let me first start by saying that commissions have always, at least especially in Maryland, we've always made certain to make sure that the general public has the opportunity to comment on our proceedings. So as a preliminary matter, a lot depends on the kind of proceeding we're talking about and exactly what role the commission has in terms of the final decision that it makes. So I'll use as an example of what most folks know of as just called a rate case. In those kinds of proceedings, the commission has some statutory responsibilities for making certain that the public is engaged. We have evening hearings, for example, that allow anyone in the public to participate by showing up at a location if we're having it in person, or most recently, as we've done over the course of the last 2 years, or 1.5 years, virtually, so that the general public can log on to any device in their home and deliver their comments that way. We have more than one. And if the public is unable to participate that way, they're able to present their comments in writing to us. Again, because those are quasi-judicial evidentiary proceedings, it's not as easy for a member of the public who's not represented by an attorney to simply participate. Certainly if they have a lawyer, they can attempt to participate as a party, but there are certain legal requirements that we have to adhere to in the event that a party wants to participate, but for example, there's somebody else in the case that already represents that same issue or that same concern. So you don't have multiple parties representing the same issue in a case. So just as an example of a particular company that uses a lot of electricity can't have two separate attorneys, they would have one. So it'd be the same kind of scenario. So in a rate case type of proceeding, there's specific types of rules we have to follow. We have to establish a record and allows a party, in the event they feel as though the decision was incorrect in some way, to move forward with an appeal. But the kinds of proceedings that we're talking about here today, and I think the kind that we're really more pointing to, are more along the lines of ones where the commissions are engaged in establishing new policy or adopting new concepts that are responsive to either the interests of the general public or perhaps our General Assembly or elected officials have directed that we proceed in a certain way. And in developing a new policy that would allow a utility company or the regulatory industry in general to move in a particular direction, like transportation electrification or community solar or location issues related to things like that. In those kinds of instances, we have a bit more flexibility with regard to the type of open processes we can have for the public to be engaged. So those are typically held in what we would call in Maryland a legislative style hearing. So by legislative style, it means it's not evidentiary. People are not testifying under oath, but the records and information that they provide is still made available to everyone that participates. We have individual consumers that can participate. There's not an opportunity to question parties or witnesses, if you will, but the commissioners will do that. So we will question parties. Parties will have the opportunity to file comments in writing and question and challenge other parties as part of that filing process. So there's still the opportunity for public hearings and for consumers who are interested to write and submit comments to us in that manner. So oftentimes what I've heard when we talk a lot about some of the limitations for parties or individuals to interact with commissions, it oftentimes ends up revolving around the concern that they have. So you have some parties that are always there. You know, your consumer advocates are always there. Your utility companies, of course, are always there. Your technical staff, they're always engaged. But depending on the issue, other parties are there or not there. And so if a consumer is having a concern about a generating plant in their neighborhood or a transmission line that's going across a farmland or something, those types of specific issues will fall under certain types of evidentiary proceeding rules that we have to follow. And so in those instances, there's certain requirements that there's certain ways in which a consumer can participate that will work in one proceeding and are available in one proceeding, but may not be available in another one. So one thing that Maryland has tried to do, and of course, these are the kinds of things that you can always improve on, but we have tried to make certain that consumers are aware of what we're going to be dealing with in advance. So that's educating people about our proceedings online through through press announcements, social media, making certain that consumers know that this is the issue we're talking about. And if it's a concern of yours, here's how you can participate. And it's important to make sure that the public understands that, keeping in mind that because these are complex matters, it's not as easy to engage in all of them as we'd like it to be, but I think that's changing. There's a number of parties that are getting far more sophisticated. They're participating in conferences like this and reading reports like the one that we're talking about today. And I think that I've started to see an improved quality of participant from the community. And that's only a positive thing. And I think that helps tremendously with issues of equity, as was discussed earlier. And that's really the way that we get around to resolving some of those challenges.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those comments. And I particularly appreciate that balance of preserving those traditional commission quasi-judicial priorities while working into new issues in different ways. We may have lost Chandra, but we'll go to Jasmine here to respond to some of those questions, and then we will have to wrap up in about 3 minutes at the top of the hour. So I'll let Jasmine make a couple more comments.
Awesome, great, thank you so much. Yeah, so I think I just wanted to add to Commissioner Linton's comments that I think one approach that I think is useful for connecting with communities is really taking a value-based approach. So thinking about what are the values of this community, what is it that they want to see, and kind of working from there. And another comment that I also wanted to make was to think about to what extent you're consulting on a regular basis with the community. And so this, this is one of the questions that we got, but I saw this question about metrics and how do we actually measure participation, what sort of accountability is there? And I think that maybe one potential metric that could exist is, is there some sort of advisory structure in place, a select group of people where you can regularly consult about issues and, having this consulting or advisory group be somewhat representative of the population or the jurisdiction. I think it's also interesting that some states, such as Minnesota, actually have formal consultation policies with tribes. And this is something that was actually enacted through executive order. So it might not necessarily be within the purview of the commission, but it's something else that I think is important to consider is having these consultation policies as, as a guiding policy is, I think, very, very useful. And also kind of on that metrics comment as well, I do want to point people to the Initiative for Energy Justice. Over the summer, they released a report on some energy justice metrics, and it kind of outlines what these metrics could look like. They're not necessarily implemented at the moment, but I think the wide array of metrics are really useful to just look at and understand and digest. So I can drop a link to that in the chat.
Great, thank you so much, Jasmine. And I too was intrigued by the question about whether there's a recommended metric for how well a Public Utility Commission is doing with stakeholder engagement. The questioner notes that some are doing really well and others have near zero stakeholder engagement and a lot of stakeholder frustration. I'll say that we're never perfect in any commission. One thing we've done is use some surveys of our stakeholder community occasionally to ask how we're doing and what can be done better. I doubt NARUC wants to create a report card of different commission success there, but you know, it really is something that NGOs could think about doing, establishing some metrics or best practices, I suppose, for stakeholder engagement. I want to thank all of our panelists for this important conversation today, and I'll turn it back over to Dominic to share some information on the upcoming webinars. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you, Chair Decker, Commissioner Linton, and Chandra as well. We will have another webinar. We have a bunch coming up. October 14th is the next one. So be sure to sign up for that on our website, where you can find a plethora of information as well on other trainings. But please try to be there the 14th. It'll be from 3 to 4 that Thursday. So thank you so much. And we will see you in October.
Great, thank you.
Bye now.